The Duke of Ravenshire had never invited a commoner into his private gardens before, let alone a flower delivery girl. But there she was, standing in the middle of the pristine greenery, gripping a bundle of roses as if they were a weapon. Perhaps, if he had known how drastically this moment would alter the course of his life, he would have thought twice before uttering the words, "Come in." But he didn't. And now, well, now it was too late. Lady Cecily Norwood, the most persistent gossip of the ton, would have fainted on the spot if she had witnessed this scandalous breach of propriety, a duke consorting with a mere shopgirl. It was utterly unthinkable. And yet something about her defiant stance, her wild chestnut-brown curls escaping from an unruly braid, or perhaps the way she looked at him as if he were merely another man and not one of the most powerful peers in England, made him hesitate. Before dismissing her, "I was told to deliver these to Lady Evelyn," the girl said, lifting her chin. She had a voice that was neither soft nor shy but steady, with an edge of challenge, as if she expected him to send her away. The Duke arched a brow. "And yet, you seem to have taken a detour through my private gardens." Her lips quirked, the ghost of a smile. "A footman directed me here. Perhaps he wished to see me thrown out by the great Duke of Ravenshire himself." That was when he noticed her eyes, deep brown, like the earth after rain, filled with a sharp intelligence that was not easily intimidated. There was something dangerously intriguing about her, something that made him forget, just for a moment, that she was entirely beneath him in station. He should send her away. That would be the proper thing to do, the expected thing, but instead, he found himself saying, "Since you are already here, you might as well stay for a moment." She tilted her head. "Why?" "Because I find myself curious, Miss Juliet." She hesitated before adding, "Juliet Bellamy." The name was simple, unremarkable, and yet he had the distinct impression that nothing about her was unremarkable at all. From the hedges, a shadow shifted. He knew without looking that one of the estate's more meddlesome housekeepers had likely witnessed this entire exchange, and would, within the hour, report to his mother that the Duke had been seen conversing with a woman of no consequence. He should care, and yet— "I should go," Juliet said, glancing toward the path. "Lady Evelyn is expecting these." The Duke had spent years maneuvering through the rigid expectations of society, avoiding scandals, ensuring his name remained untarnished. He had never once risked his reputation for a fleeting conversation with a stranger, but for reasons he could not yet explain, he said, "Come back tomorrow." Her breath hitched slightly, but she did not ask why. Instead, she studied him for a long moment. Then, without curtsying, without any of the reverence his title demanded, she merely nodded, and with that she walked away, leaving the scent of roses and something far more dangerous in her wake. The Duke of Ravenshire had made a mistake, or at least that was what he told himself the next morning as he paced the length of his study, his hands clasped behind his back. Inviting a flower delivery girl back to his gardens, what had possessed him? Was he so in need of entertainment that he had resorted to engaging in idle conversation with a commoner? And yet, he could not forget the way Juliet Bellamy had looked at him, not with deference or admiration, as so many did, but with something else entirely. A quiet defiance, a challenge, as if she were not the least bit intimidated by his title. It was maddening. "Your Grace," came a voice from the doorway. His mother, the Dowager Duchess of Ravenshire, entered with the precision of a general marching into battle, her silver-grey gown as immaculate as her reputation. She arched a delicate brow, her dark eyes, so much like his own, assessing him. "You are distracted," she observed. He exhaled, "Simply thinking." "A dangerous pastime," she murmured, lowering herself into a chair. "Especially when the subject of your thoughts is a flower girl." He went still. "Who told you?" My dear, you underestimate how quickly news travels among the staff. By luncheon, half the servants were whispering about how the great Duke of Ravenshire spent an afternoon entertaining a tradeswoman in his gardens. Hardly entertaining. He scowled. She was merely delivering flowers. Of course, she said smoothly, though her expression held a flicker of amusement. Then you will not mind if I have a quiet word with Lady Evelyn, suggesting she order her arrangements from another supplier? Surely we can avoid any further disruptions. The idea made his stomach twist uncomfortably, which was absurd. What? Did it matter where the flowers came from? And yet the thought of never seeing Juliet Bellamy again sat poorly with him. That will not be necessary, he said carefully. His mother tilted her head. No? How interesting. He ignored her, striding toward the window. Outside, the gardens were bathed in the pale morning light, a sharp contrast to the storm brewing within him. He would forget her. He had to. Juliet Bellamy had no intention of returning to Ravenshire's gardens. Absolutely none. And yet, there she was, standing before the estate's grand iron gates, feeling utterly ridiculous. The Duke's invitation had been unexpected, and she had spent the entire night replaying it in her mind, searching for some hidden meaning. Was he toying with her, bored with the rigid expectations of his world and eager for a distraction? Either way, she had no business stepping into his domain again. And yet, Juliet was no fool. She had grown up in a world that did not often extend kindness to women like her. Women without fortunes, without noble blood, without protection. She knew better than to believe in fairy tales. But she also knew an opportunity when she saw one. Connection to a powerful man, even the briefest one, could mean everything. A chance to secure better business for her employer. A chance to ensure her younger brother, Theo, would never go hungry again. And so, against her better judgment, she stepped through the gates. The Duke had not expected her to come. When Juliet Bellamy appeared in the gardens that afternoon, a faint breeze tousling her unruly curls, he felt something sharp and unwelcome twist in his chest. Foolish. He was being foolish. Yet instead of sending her away, he found himself saying, "You came." She lifted a brow. "You invited me, and here I thought you would be wise enough to refuse." She smirked. "I am rarely wise, Your Grace." He should not have found that endearing, and yet somehow he did. If the Duke of Ravenshire had any sense left in him, he would have dismissed Juliet Bellamy the moment she stepped into his gardens again. But there she was, standing in the afternoon light, her arms crossed, waiting. And instead of sending her away, he found himself studying her, truly studying her. She was not beautiful in the way society dictated, with porcelain skin and golden curls. No, her beauty was something else entirely, something untamed. Her chestnut brown hair, though braided, refused to be tamed, with wisps curling stubbornly around her face. Her eyes, sharp and dark, held an intelligence he rarely saw in the carefully polished ladies of the ton. And then there was her mouth, set in a smirk, as if she had already anticipated whatever ridiculous reason he would use to justify inviting. Her back, infuriating woman. "I nearly did not come," she said, tilting her head, "yet here you are." She sighed dramatically. "Yes, well, I am a woman of weak resolve." A laugh nearly escaped him, nearly. He caught it just in time, clearing his throat instead. "Is that so?" "Indeed," she said. "You see, Your Grace, when a powerful Duke summons a lowly flower girl to his private gardens, one must assume it is for some nefarious purpose. Perhaps you intend to imprison me here, or worse, force me to discuss proper etiquette over tea." He arched a brow. "And yet, you came willingly." She lifted one shoulder in a careless shrug. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing." His lips twitched. He should not enjoy her company. He should not admire her quick wit or the way she seemed entirely unimpressed by his title. And yet, here he was. Juliet knew she was playing a dangerous game. She had met nobles before, always in passing, always as an invisible presence in the background. She knew how they looked at people like her, as if she did not matter, as if she were merely another piece of furniture in the room, useful only for providing whatever service was required before being dismissed. But the Duke of Ravenshire, he looked at her differently, not with disdain, not with idle curiosity, but as if he were trying to decipher some great puzzle, one he had not yet decided was worth solving. It unsettled her, and perhaps more dangerously, it intrigued her. "So," she said, watching him carefully, "are you going to tell me why I'm here?" His gaze flickered to hers. "You are the one who accepted my invitation, Miss Bellamy." "Ah, so this is a test of my own foolishness," she mused. "How wicked of you, Your Grace." He exhaled through his nose, something dangerously close to amusement flashing in his dark eyes. "I suppose I was merely curious." Juliet arched a brow. "About what?" There was a long silence, and then, "Why you looked at me the way you did yesterday," he said. That caught her off guard. "The way I looked at you." He took a slow step closer. "As if you did not care that I was a duke." Juliet hesitated, because the truth was she did care, just not in the way he thought. She had spent her entire life aware of the vast, immovable divide between the nobility and people like her. She knew what men like him were capable of, how they shaped the world with their power, with their wealth, and how they so often discarded those who had neither. So no, she had not looked at him with awe or reverence, but that did not mean she was unaffected. "Would you prefer that I swoon at your feet?" she asked lightly. Something dark flickered in his gaze. "No." Her breath caught, because suddenly there was something between them, something heavy, unspoken, and Juliet, for the first time in her life, did not know whether to run from it or step closer. Juliet should have left. Every sensible bone in her body told her so. She was standing far too close to a man she had no business even speaking to, much less challenging with her sharp tongue and sharper gaze. But she didn't leave. Instead, she held his stare, waiting for him to say something, anything, that might break the tension stretching between them like a taut wire, ready to snap. The Duke of Ravenshire was not a man who was ignored, nor was he a man accustomed to women looking at him as though they saw past his title, past his perfectly tailored waistcoat, and into something deeper. But that was precisely what Juliet Bellamy was doing, and God help him, he found that he did not want to look away. "I suspect your mother would be scandalized if she knew I was here," Juliet mused, her voice laced with amusement. The corner of his mouth lifted. "She is scandalized by many things. A flower girl in my gardens would merely be added to the list," Juliet smirked. "How fortunate for me, then, to be part of such an esteemed collection of offenses." He huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "You truly have no sense of self-preservation, do you?" "Oh, I do," she countered. "But I also have an unfortunate tendency toward curiosity, and at present I am curious about something rather important." He lifted a brow. "And what is that?" She took a slow step forward, tilting her head. "Why did you ask me to come back, Your Grace?" That was the question, wasn't it? The question he had been asking himself all morning. The answer should have been simple: boredom, amusement, a passing whim that would mean nothing in the end. And yet, when he opened his mouth to respond, none of those words came. Instead, he found himself saying, "I do not know." A flicker of something unreadable passed over Juliet's face, and for the first time since they met, she looked almost uncertain. He did not like it. He liked her sharp edges, her boldness. He liked that she did not shrink beneath his gaze. as so many others did. And so, before he could think better of it, he added, "Perhaps I wished to see if you would come." Her lips parted slightly, as if caught off guard. "I see," she murmured. Before he could respond, the sound of voices drifted toward them from beyond the hedges. His mother and someone else. His jaw tightened. "You should go." Juliet hesitated for the briefest moment. Then, with a sharp nod, she turned on her heel and slipped through the garden path, disappearing into the shadows just as the Dowager Duchess stepped into view. "Talking to the roses, are we?" his mother asked dryly, surveying the empty space. Where Juliet had just stood, his pulse remained steady. "They are better conversationalists than some." His mother arched a knowing brow. "I do hope for your sake that is true, because the last thing this family needs is another scandal." She turned sharply on her heel and strode back toward the house, leaving him alone once more. And for the first time in his life, the Duke of Ravenshire realized something troubling. Did not mind a little scandal, not if it meant seeing Juliet Bellamy again. Juliet knew she had made a mistake the moment she stepped out of the Duke's gardens, not because she regretted going. Oh no, that was not the problem. The problem was that she wanted to go back. And that was dangerous, foolish, reckless, utterly disastrous. She adjusted the basket of flowers on her arm, quickening her pace as she made her way through the winding streets of Mayfair. The air was thick with the scent of fresh bread and damp cobblestones, the chatter of merchants filling the space between her thoughts. This was her world, not the perfectly manicured hedges of Ravenshire's estate, not the gleaming halls where dukes and duchesses waltzed without a care in the world, and certainly not in the orbit of a man like him. She barely had time to collect herself before she heard her name. "Juliet!" She turned just in time to see Theo, her 12-year-old brother, running toward her, his brown hair flopping into his eyes. He was too thin, his coat too worn at the elbows, but his smile was bright. She caught him before he crashed into her. "Theo, what have I told you about running through the streets like a hooligan?" He grinned. "That I'll get trampled by a carriage and you'll refuse to mourn me?" "Precisely." She ruffled his hair, ignoring the familiar pang in her chest. He was still too young to understand how precarious their position was. "Are you bringing home dinner?" he asked, peeking into her basket. She swallowed. "I'll find something." Theo's expression faltered, but he nodded. "I can work more at the docks if—" "No." Her voice was firm. "You're staying in school." They had already lost too much. Their father's death had taken everything from them, their home, their security, their future. But Juliet refused to let it take Theo's education. He deserved better, even if it meant she had to do foolish things, reckless things, even if it meant returning to Ravenshire. The Duke of Ravenshire was in a foul mood. That in itself was not unusual. He was frequently irritated by Parliament, by his mother, by the insufferable rules of society that dictated his every move. But today, his irritation had a name, Juliet Bellamy. He had told himself he would not think of her, that she was nothing more than a passing amusement, a momentary distraction from the suffocating expectations of his world. And yet here he was, standing at the window of his study, watching the street below as if expecting her to appear. This was unacceptable. With a sigh, he turned away, only to find his mother standing in the doorway. "I see you are brooding," she observed. He pinched the bridge of his nose. "Did you come here simply to irritate me?" "No, but it is an added benefit." She stepped inside, her skirts whispering against the floor. "I hear there have been whispers." His spine straightened. "Whispers." "Oh, do not look so surprised. You have been seen speaking to a flower girl in your gardens, and people do love a good scandal." His jaw clenched. "It was nothing, was it?" He exhaled sharply. "It was a conversation, Mother, nothing more." "Then you will have no objection to never seeing her again." He should have agreed. He should have nodded and let the matter rest. But instead, he found himself saying, "That is entirely unnecessary." The Dowager Duchess arched a brow, a slow smile curving her lips. "Oh, my dear boy, you are in far more trouble than you realize." She turned and swept from the room, leaving him alone with a troubling realization. He had no intention of never seeing Juliet Bellamy again, and that was a problem. Juliet should have been focusing on her work. She should have been trimming stems, arranging bouquets, and making polite conversation with the ladies who stepped into the flower shop, their delicate hands wrapped in gloves worth more than Juliet's entire week's wages. Instead, she was thinking about a certain Duke, a very frustrating, very impossible, very irritatingly compelling Duke. "Juliet, are you listening?" She blinked, snapping back to reality as her employer, Mrs. Finch, frowned at her from across the shop counter. The older woman had a sharp nose and sharper eyes, the kind that missed nothing. "Yes," Juliet said quickly. "You were saying—" "I was saying," Mrs. Finch drawled, "that Lady Evelyn's order is ready and I need you to deliver it." Juliet stiffened. "To Ravenshire?" Mrs. Finch gave her a knowing look. "Is that a problem?" "Yes, a very large one." "Not at all," Juliet said, forcing a smile. Mrs. Finch hummed. "I do wonder, dear, why you've been so distracted lately, and why the Duke of Ravenshire suddenly seems so interested in our little shop." Juliet's stomach flipped. "The Duke? Oh, yes," Mrs. Finch said, far too casually. "A footman of his came by this morning, wanted to know if we plan to send the same delivery girl as last time." Juliet's pulse skittered. He was asking about her. "Oh," she said, pretending to be unaffected. "Well, I suppose I should go then," Mrs. Finch smirked. "Yes, dear, you suppose you should." The moment Juliet stepped onto Ravenshire's estate, she knew it was a mistake. It was one thing to have a single stolen conversation with a duke in the privacy of his gardens. It was another entirely to walk up to his doorstep, brazen as anything, as if she belonged there. She did not belong there. And yet, when the butler ushered her inside, when she was led down a grand hallway lined with gilded mirrors and ancient portraits, she did not protest, because a part of her, a very small, very foolish part, wanted to see him again. She did not have to wait long. He was already there when she was led into the sitting room, standing by the fireplace, as if he had been expecting her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with an exasperated sigh, he said, "You should not have come." Juliet huffed. "Oh, well, forgive me, Your Grace, for daring to deliver flowers as I was hired to do." His mouth twitched. "You know that is not what I meant." She crossed her arms. "Then say what you mean." He exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. "People are talking." "Let them talk," she said, though her stomach tightened. "You do not understand," he said, stepping closer. "My mother has heard the rumors. Soon the ton will as well." Juliet swallowed hard. "And what do the rumors say?" His jaw clenched. "That I have taken an interest in a common girl." Her breath hitched. "Because that was dangerous." "Have you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A long silence. Then his dark gaze met hers, and he said softly, deliberately, "Yes." Juliet's heart slammed against her ribs, and for the first time in her life, she had no idea what to do next. Juliet could not breathe. The Duke of Ravenshire had just admitted, openly, deliberately, that he was interested in her. That should have been impossible. Dukes did not take an interest in flower girls. They married duchesses, hosted grand balls, and lived in a world where women like Juliet existed only to decorate the background. And yet, here he was, standing before her in his lavish sitting room, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse stutter. She needed to leave, immediately. "Your Grace," she said, gripping the basket of flowers as if it might anchor her, "this is highly inappropriate." His lips twitched, as if she had just said something amusing. "You are worried about propriety now." "Yes," she snapped, mostly to cover the fact that her knees were threatening to give out. Because I have to live in this world, and if people start talking, they already are talking, he interrupted. Juliet swallowed, and that was the real danger, wasn't it? Not just his interest, but the fact that people had noticed. A scandal like this would not touch him. He was a duke. He could ruin a dozen reputations and still receive invitations to every ball of the season. But Juliet, a single whisper could cost her everything. She took a step back, forcing herself to stay calm. I should go. He took a step forward. Do you want to go? Her breath caught. She should say yes. She should remind him that whatever foolish attraction existed between them was a disaster waiting to happen. Instead, she said, "That does not matter." His gaze darkened. "It matters to me." God help her. Juliet turned sharply toward the door, desperate to escape before she lost what little self-control she had left. But before she could reach it, the door swung open, and standing there looking absolutely furious was the Dowager Duchess of Ravenshire. The silence in the room was suffocating. The Dowager Duchess did not need to raise her voice to command attention. She merely stepped inside, letting the door click shut behind her, and pinned Juliet with a look so sharp it could have sliced glass. Juliet clenched her jaw. She would not cower. "Leave us," the Dowager Duchess said. Juliet stiffened, ready to argue, but then the Duke said no. The Dowager's eyes flickered toward her son, her expression unreadable. "No?" The Duke crossed his arms. "Juliet stays." Juliet's stomach flipped. That was the first time he had said her name, just Juliet, without the barriers of formality, and it terrified her. The Dowager turned back to Juliet, her lips curling in a polite but utterly insincere smile. "My dear, I am certain you are a sensible young woman. Surely you must understand how unwise this situation is." Juliet lifted her chin. "I was merely delivering flowers," the Dowager hummed, unconvinced. "And yet my son seems to believe you are something more." Juliet's throat tightened. "That is not my doing." "Perhaps not," the Dowager said smoothly, "but you would do well to end it before it begins." Before Juliet could respond, the Dowager turned back to the Duke. "You're playing a dangerous game, my son." His jaw clenched. "This is not a game." That seemed to surprise the Dowager. For a long moment she studied him, as if trying to decide whether he had truly lost his mind. Then, with a sigh, she turned back to Juliet. "You seem like a sensible girl," she said again. "So I will offer you one piece of advice. Walk away." Juliet's hands curled into fists, because the worst part, she knew the Dowager was right, and yet she turned to the Duke, and his dark eyes, so steady, so certain, nearly undid her. What was she supposed to do now? Juliet had always known how to survive. She had learned young that the world was not kind to girls like her, girls without titles, without wealth, without protection. She had learned that to step out of place, to invite the wrong kind of attention, was to invite ruin. And yet she stood in the opulent sitting room of a duke, caught between his burning gaze and the cold warning of his mother. She should walk away. She should not hesitate, but the way he was looking at her, as if she were not just a passing amusement, not just another nameless face in the crowd, made it difficult to move, made it impossible to leave. The Dowager Duchess sighed. "Ah, I see." Juliet blinked. "See what?" The older woman's lips curled in something that was not quite a smile. "You are already lost." Juliet's stomach tightened. "I don't know what you mean." The Dowager tilted her head, studying her like one might study a puzzle missing a piece. "Do you believe for even a moment that this will end well?" Juliet opened her mouth, then closed it, because no. Of course, it would not end well. It would end in ruin, in heartbreak, in scandal. It would end exactly as the Dowager Duchess predicted. And yet, she still did not move. A knowing look flickered across the Dowager's face. "You poor foolish girl," Juliet exhaled sharply. "I have no intentions toward your son, Your Grace." The Dowager arched a brow. "Do not make the mistake of thinking I am your enemy, Miss Bellamy." That caught Juliet off guard. The Dowager smoothed her skirts. "You think I am here to warn you away from him, but you misunderstand. I am warning you for your sake." Juliet frowned. "I can take care of myself." A sharp, knowing smile. "Can you?" A muscle ticked in Juliet's jaw, because the truth was, no matter how clever, how careful, how cautious she was, she would never be able to protect herself from what would come next. The scandal, the whispers, the way her name would be spoken in drawing rooms with pity and disdain in equal measure, the way the Duke would eventually have to let her go, because he would let her go. He had to, didn't he? The Duke of Ravenshire had never been a patient man. He had spent his life adhering to expectations, to duty, to the rigid demands of his title. He had played the part of the perfect Duke, always proper, always in control. And then Juliet Bellamy had walked into his gardens, and nothing had made sense since. He watched her now, watched the way her fingers tightened around the handle of her basket, the way her shoulders lifted ever so slightly, as if bracing for a storm. His mother was wrong. Juliet was not lost. He was. "I will not apologize," he said suddenly. Both Juliet and his mother turned to look at him. The Dowager sighed. "Of course not." Juliet's breath hitched. "Your Grace." He took a step forward. "I will not apologize for what I feel." His mother made a disapproving noise. "Feelings are irrelevant, my son," he exhaled sharply. "Not to me." Juliet shook her head. "You don't understand." "I do understand," he interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "I understand that you are afraid. I understand that you think this is impossible." She swallowed hard. "Isn't it?" He stepped closer until there was barely any space between them. "Not if I don't allow it to be." Juliet's breath faltered. His mother's sigh was long-suffering. "You will regret this." The Duke's gaze did not waver. "Then let me." The Dowager shook her head, turning toward the door. "You are a fool, my son." And with that she swept from the room, leaving them alone. A heavy silence settled between them. Juliet licked her lips. "You should not do this," he exhaled. "And yet I will." And for the first time, Juliet truly believed him. Juliet had made many mistakes in her life. Once as a child, she had stolen an apple from a market stall, thinking the vendor wouldn't notice. He had. At 16, she had trusted a charming young man with warm smiles and empty promises. He had left, and now, standing in the middle of a Duke's sitting room, staring at a man who should be impossible for her to have, she knew, without a doubt, that this was the gravest mistake of them all, because the Duke of Ravenshire had just declared himself, not in grand words, not in sweeping poetry, but in the kind of quiet, deliberate certainty that left no room for doubt and worse. She believed him. "This is madness," she whispered. His gaze never wavered. "Perhaps," she took a shaky breath. "Your mother is right. We will regret this." He took a step closer. "Then let me regret it." Juliet's hands trembled at her sides, because this was not a game. This was a man with the power to ruin her, the power to save her, and the power to break her heart into 1,000 pieces. And she was just a flower girl who had made the mistake of letting herself believe, even for a moment, that she could be something more. She shook her head. You don't understand what this will cost me." His jaw tightened. "Then tell me." She swallowed hard. "If people think I have been compromised, no respectable household will hire me. I will be ruined, Your Grace." Something dark flickered in his gaze. "Then I will ensure you are protected." She let out a sharp laugh. "And how will you do that? Marry me." The words were meant to be a joke, meant to throw cold water over whatever foolishness had taken hold of them. But the moment they left her lips, the air changed. The Duke did not laugh. He did not scoff, did not recoil. He simply held her gaze and said, softly, deliberately, "Yes." Juliet's breath hitched, her stomach turned to ice. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, you don't mean that." He took another step closer, his voice steady. "I do." Panic clawed at her throat. "This is not a fairy tale, Your Grace," he exhaled sharply. "I know." Juliet's hands curled into fists. "You cannot just decide to change the rules of society because you wish it." A muscle ticked in his jaw. "Why not?" She huffed out a bitter laugh. "Because you are a duke, because you are expected to marry a woman of rank, a woman with breeding, a woman who is not you," he finished quietly. Silence. Her throat tightened. "Yes." His expression was unreadable. "And if I do not care for those expectations?" She forced herself to meet his gaze. "Then you are a greater fool than I thought." A small smile ghosted over his lips. "Perhaps?" She let out a slow, shuddering breath. "You don't understand." "Then make me." Her heart pounded. "I have spent my entire life trying to survive. I cannot afford to be reckless. I cannot afford to hope. And I certainly cannot afford to be a duke's mistake." His expression darkened. "You are not a mistake." Her throat burned. She wanted to believe him. God help her, she wanted to believe him. But reality was cruel. And so, before he could say another word, before she could make the most foolish decision of her life, she turned and walked away. And this time, she did not look back. Juliet had walked away from many things in her life: hunger, heartbreak, hope. But walking away from the Duke of Ravenshire, that was the hardest of them all. She had done it, though, had forced her feet to move, had kept her head high even when her heart screamed at her to turn back, because she knew what would happen if she stayed. She would believe him, and believing a man like that, a man who had the luxury of throwing caution to the wind, who could afford to challenge society's rules, that would destroy her. So she had left, and by the time she reached the flower shop, she had convinced herself she had done the right thing. Until the scandal broke. It started with whispers. At first, Juliet ignored them. The stolen glances from customers, the hushed voices that faded when she entered a room. These were things she had endured before. But then the whispers turned to open stares, and then the stares turned into something worse. Judgment, condemnation, pity. The first sign of trouble came when Mrs. Finch called her into the back room, her face drawn. "Juliet, dear," she said carefully, "perhaps it would be best if you took a few days off." Juliet stiffened. "Why?" Mrs. Finch hesitated. "There have been rumors." Cold dread curled in Juliet's stomach. "What rumors?" Mrs. Finch sighed. "That you have caught the eye of a duke." Juliet's mouth went dry. Mrs. Finch gave her a pointed look. "Is it true?" Juliet swallowed. "It does not matter." Mrs. Finch sighed. "Oh, but it does. Because if society believes you have been compromised, no respectable lady will order from us again." Juliet's stomach lurched. "I have done nothing wrong." "I know that," Mrs. Finch said gently, "but the tongue does not care what is true, only what they choose to believe." Juliet felt something inside her crack. This was exactly what she had feared. This was why she had walked away, and yet it had not been enough. The damage was already done. The Duke of Ravenshire did not often lose control. He had spent years perfecting the art of restraint. of playing by the rules set before him. But when he heard the rumors, when he learned that Juliet Bellamy was being ruined because of him, he saw red. "She will be cast out," his mother said, her voice clipped. "No one will hire her. No one will marry her. And for what?" His jaw tightened. "For me," the dowager exhaled sharply. "Then do something about it." His hands curled into fists. "I intend to." His mother arched a brow. "Oh?" He met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "I will marry her." The dowager went very, very still, and then, after a long, excruciating silence, she laughed. It was not a kind laugh. "Do not be ridiculous," she said, shaking her head. "You cannot possibly—" "I will." His mother's smile faded. "You would throw away everything, your title, your reputation, your future, for her?" He exhaled. "You misunderstand, Mother." A flicker of confusion crossed her face. "Oh?" His lips curved. "I am not throwing anything away." And then, without another word, he turned on his heel and went to find Juliet Bellamy. Epilogue. Juliet Bellamy had spent her entire life fighting to survive. She had learned to keep her head down, to work hard, to never ask for more than the world was willing to give her. But now, standing in the middle of Ravenshire's grand ballroom, wearing a gown finer than anything she had ever dared to touch, she realized something. She had never learned how to belong. She was not meant to be here. And yet, as the Duke of Ravenshire took her hand in his, as hundreds of noble eyes watched, in stunned silence, she knew she was here, because he had chosen her, because she had let herself choose him too. The scandal had been swift. When the Duke had announced his engagement to a flower girl, society had exploded. The ton had gasped. Ladies had clutched their pearls. Men had placed bets on how long it would take for him to come to his senses. But the Duke had not wavered. He had ignored the whispers, had stood by her, had defended her name, had made it very clear that there would be consequences for anyone who dared to insult his future wife. And now here they were, engaged, together, utterly, irreversibly scandalous. "You're staring," Juliet murmured, her fingers laced with his. The Duke smirked. "Am I?" She arched a brow. "Do you regret it yet?" His grip tightened. "Not for a single moment." Juliet's throat tightened. "You really are the most stubborn man alive." He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear. "And you, Miss Bellamy, are a terrible influence." A laugh bubbled out of her, because she knew now that this was real, this was theirs, and for the first time in her life, she was not just surviving, she was living, and she was loved.